Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Kaler and I own Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston. I'm happy to welcome you here tonight to this conversation between Bill Gates and Sal Khan. We're thrilled to co-host this event with our good friends at Book People in Austin. Before we get started, we have some housekeeping. Thanks to everyone who pre-submitted questions for the event. Mr. Gates's team has reviewed them and selected which ones will be asked. If you post anything from today's event on social media, feel free to tag us. We're at Blue Willow Books and at Book People. We'd love to stay in touch with you. By registering for this event, you are agreeing to refrain from engaging in inappropriate behavior and harassment of any kind throughout the course of this event, i.e. racial slurs, profanity, hate speech, and spam comments. Please note that any participants who engage in inappropriate behavior or harassment of any kind will be immediately ejected from this event. The Gates team has provided a short video that will play before the conversation with Bill Gates and Sal Khan. We hope you enjoy the event and appreciate your support of two Texas independent bookstores.
In a typical year, the world emits over 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And as we keep doing that, the consequences for human life will be catastrophic. When I first fell in love with computers as a teenager, they were enormous, expensive, and only the government and big companies could afford them. But my friends and I became obsessed with a wild idea. What could we do if there was a computer on every desk? And now the wild idea is quite tame. Billions of people not only have computers on their desks, but even in their pockets. Now the world needs another breakthrough. In fact, it needs many breakthroughs. We need to get from 51 billion tons to zero while still meeting the planet's basic needs. That means we need to transform the way we do almost everything. Our commitment to developing these innovations will mean the difference between a future where everyone can live a healthy, productive life and one where we're constantly dealing with the human and financial crises at a historic scale. Entrepreneurs and investors have to build new businesses and change existing businesses to get these solutions deployed. Government leaders have to enact new policies that drive the market for clean energy. And advocates have to keep their voices loud to hold all of us accountable for rapid progress. Avoiding a climate disaster will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on. Greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. And my basic optimism about climate change comes from my belief in innovation. It's our power to invent that makes me hopeful.
Hey everyone, it's Sal Khan here from Khan Academy. Thanks for joining this conversation with Bill Gates. You saw this amazing video. I want to give a special thanks to the Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston, Texas, and the Book People Bookshop in Austin, Texas for hosting us today on what is arguably the most, I would say, the most important conversation we can have right now. So Bill, thank you for joining and being willing to answer our questions. It's very exciting to have you here, Bill. The book is an incredible book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. So maybe a good place to start, you've done many things in your life. You mentioned in that video your involvement in technology. You mentioned, you've worked on healthcare, you've worked on education. Why focus so much of your energies on climate, and why write this book right now?
Yeah, it was in the year 2000 when the Gates Foundation started doing projects in Africa. And so I was traveling there and seeing that there was no electricity. In fact, in most years, the amount of electricity added is less than the population growth. And I was also hearing about the climate making it harder for farming. And, over 70% of the jobs there are people who do farming. And so I decided I should understand this constraint, climate change. And I was lucky that a few professors would come and spend 6 half days with me picking various topics, the climate models, ice melting, carbon capture. And, they got me reading people like Václav Smil and, realizing, wow, energy and emissions are broadly embedded. And thinking of these farmers close to the equator, where their crops would fail more often and the productivity would be less, it meant, I really wanted to understand, were we going to be able to meet this challenge or not? And by 2010, I had thought about it enough that I did a TED Talk. So I have two fairly well-known TED Talks. The climate change one is 2010, and then the one about we're not ready for the next pandemic was 2015. But I have to say, writing a book's a lot of work. It wasn't until I saw the movement getting strong, and even during the pandemic, when you'd expect people to be distracted, this has now a lot of political resonance, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. But that in a way, the field wasn't paying enough attention to the hard stuff, and it didn't have metrics that really would predict, are we on a path to get to zero or not? And so it's then, after so many people were asking me about climate, I thought, okay, I'm going to write this down and try to make it appealing and try and energize people, because it'd be terrible to have this young generation who cares and have them see that it really didn't come together.
And I'd love to dig a little bit into your own personal journey on this, because it sounds like you fell into it when you're visiting places. You're thinking kind of incidentally how climate might be impacting people. But at some point, a bit flipped, where you started saying, hey, I need to do something about it. And even though many people will look at you and say, you're Bill Gates, you have resources, you have know-how, you have people you can work with. Did you go through a bit of a psychological process of like, this is too big even for me to tackle, or it's hopeless?
Well, it's definitely too big for me to tackle. I mean, our foundation has a lot of resources, and there's some areas like, diarrheal vaccines that even if we're the primary funder, we can actually get it created and even get it distributed. But climate change, even just the energy piece is $5 trillion a year, and it's so embedded in everything. So even philanthropists can only be catalytic. The general policies and taxes and all kinds of things are going to push us in this direction. This is for big governments, but philanthropists can, back ideas at the early stage, with an appropriately modified venture capital approach. It's going to take a mind-blowing number of people believing in this, even in both parties, who, even if they disagree on how to go about it, they better accept that this is a goal, because in the 30 years is pretty short time because of the scale involved. We can't waste, any year or 4-year period in that next 30 years.
Yeah, and it seems like even in the title of this book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. I mean, you didn't title it, here's some information about climate change, or did you know about carbon? You said how to avoid a climate disaster. It sounds like you want something psychological to happen in our collective consciousness. How intentional was that?
Yeah, well, when I, did the speech about the pandemic, I wanted people to pay attention. A few billion extra, would have had the diagnostic capacity in place. And the US could have been more like Australia than the tragedy that we've experienced. And so the idea of how do you raise attention, particularly here when it's much, much harder than just inventing a single vaccine, which, thank God is going to bring the pandemic to an end. So I wanted to be both hopeful and still point out that this is very, very critical. Even the natural ecosystem die-off we see today, the wildfires, the difficulty for these poor farmers, it's already a problem, but you might miss it. But as you go out to the end of the century, as beaches disappear and, many ecosystems are gone by then, and, particularly the people near the equator will be trying to get out of those areas. So you'll have massive instability. So I wanted to say, I think it's pretty important. It's not, a hobby. I haven't picked this in addition to the global health work, just because it's interesting. It's those, potentially unbelievable negative things. For example, it'll be killing 5 times as many people as the pandemic at its worst every year, and just going up from there.
No, I mean, that's mind-boggling. You just touched on it. And I think most folks out there, probably folks listening, and we're speaking here in Texas, and once again, thanks to the Blue Willow Bookshop and Book People for hosting this. But most people have this generalized idea. Okay, there's these greenhouse gases that are being emitted. It captures more energy from the sun. It captures heat, and sea levels will go up or weather patterns will change. But we're all on kind of a journey on how bad is it. So before we go into the solutions, why don't you scare us a little bit more? But not that you needed credibility, but you obviously built more credibility because you kind of predicted the pandemic and spoke about it, and we wish we had followed you. So for anyone who's skeptical, I don't think anyone watching is, but scare us a little bit before we get into the solutions.
Yeah, it's a very unusual phenomena that when heat comes into the Earth, it's mostly these visible wavelengths, which is why we evolved to detect that radiation to navigate. When the heat leaves the Earth, it goes back at a different wavelength because the heat profile of the Earth, we're not as hot as the sun is. And weirdly, as you put CO2 in the atmosphere, even the 410 parts per million, which is where we are today, that reflects enough of that heat back that the equilibrium temperature goes up. And we predict 2 degrees centigrade would be the least increase we could experience. We do a really good job. If we don't take this seriously, it could be 4 degrees or more. And that has a gigantic effect on the weather. The number of days that near the equator you can't do outside work will be very large. And the human body actually is great at dealing with heat. We lost our fur, we have sweat glands, our upright structure lets our nose dissipate heat. But at a certain temperature and humidity, none of that works. And so you die. And that's what we're facing in these parts of the world. The natural ecosystems, coral reefs are dying off massively. And even if we do a good job, very limited number will make it through. Nature can't change as fast as this temperature forcing is moving things around. If it was, say 100 times slower, evolution could adjust these behavioral patterns. As it is, many species will die off, and then millions of years from now, those niches, something will evolve into them, but that'll be past any sort of human history that we can contemplate. So it really is very dramatic. It's weird because CO2 is completely invisible. You can't smell it, but because it's this asymmetric molecule, the heat trying to get out bounces off of it like a mirror.
Yeah, that last point is an interesting one because Earth isn't necessarily going to go away, but the ability for Earth to be suitable for us. So there might, if we don't do the things right in 60 million years, there might be some super intelligent porcupine saying, thank God those humans have made it so good for us. Where do you see, a lot of people will hear like, 2 degrees Celsius, that's roughly 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, that's a little bit warmer, 4 degrees. How about you made it, you're saying on the equator, it might not be, you can't even live in certain parts of the equator. How bad could it be? And then what if we just extrapolate kind of what we're doing now? We're making some efforts, but it's not enough. And we're going to talk about it in a second. What's going to happen, not just to temperature, but to geopolitics, to human migration, wars? What's your best prediction?
Yeah, so the emissions curve, with some tiny wiggles for economic depression or war, and for the pandemic, is about a 8% reduction, which it's amazing that's all it is given how disrupted the economy is. The emission curve just keeps going up. Even though some rich countries, by using renewables and some electric cars, are starting to go down off their peak, the developing countries with population growth and just building basic structures mean that we haven't had any meaningful decrease. So the idea the curve looks like this and then all of a sudden it's going down like 6% a year, that's quite a feat given all the sectors of emission involved. The worst things are where you don't have controlled climate. Some parts of the US in the summer, you're indoors with air conditioning quite a bit, but that's nowhere near the hottest parts of the earth. I mean, yes, Texas will get, I cite an increase in hot days, but it's not as bad as southern India or Iraq or Iran. There it's going to be so much worse that farming and construction won't work. Even if you're in an office without an air conditioner, we've seen substantial losses in productivity of learning, getting jobs done when the heat is higher. Humans just aren't adjusted to that. So if you only, cared about living in Canada, you don't care about the natural ecosystems or disruption to other people, it's less cold, you can grow more crops. You might even think of it as a net benefit in a local sense. But for the world, huge amounts of our population are in these very, very tough areas. And even a small disturbance, the Syrian civil war, which was partly climate related, look at what that did to Europe, thinking about refugees. Well, this is 100 times as many people leaving their countries to try to get to someplace that's more livable. So the cumulative effect of, they can't grow their crops and they're moving around, that causes, disruption, civil war, and, a huge setback from the general trend of improvement in health and education that humanity should be so proud of.
And I just want to paint the picture even a little bit more. You mentioned the 51 billion tons of carbon emissions. And, people are like, wait, how do you weigh air? Well, air has mass to it, and trees are made out of carbon. And I actually thought about it a little bit. It was I looked up how much does a redwood weigh. It's apparently a super huge redwood's about 1.6 million pounds. So we're talking about like 100 million of the biggest redwood trees you could imagine every year vaporizing and being thrown into the air. Where is this 51 billion coming from? What's the breakdown? I was actually surprised. I thought I knew about this, but it was a different weighting than I imagined.
Yeah, the breadth of it is pretty daunting and not something most people know. So I have the slide that shows the 5 big areas. Electricity, of course, people do think about that. That's coal and natural gas. Transportation, 16% overall. Passenger cars are big there, but trucks, buses, and planes are going to be much tougher. You can't just electrify them because the energy density of the battery is far lower, 20 times lower than the gasoline. And so that isn't going to be easy. Agriculture in there at 9%, that's cows burping and farting methane. It's manure, it's making fertilizer. Heating and cooling buildings, often with natural gas, is big. But then the biggest single segment, and the one that I think most people, because it's all so cheap and works so well, that they've been allowed to just kind of ignore the miracle of it, is the manufacturing sector. Cement alone, 6%, steel 6%. And in many of those cases, there is no Tesla, showing us the path to where the green product is as good over time as the current dirty product. With steel and cement, the extra cost is so gigantic that we really haven't gotten started on those. And even the Department of Energy doesn't think of that as part of their thing, because it's not really energy, it's the industrial economy. And there are so many steel plants around the world and cement plants. What we're saying is in 30 years, we'll invent a new way, make it cheap, and deploy it to all of those locations.
Yeah, that was the one that was really surprising for me. I knew about it a little bit, that manufacturing, especially things like cement, but the fact that it's roughly double transportation. Most people point to car emissions, folks also point to electricity and coal-fired power plants and things like that. But the big one is around the manufacturing, and then agriculture is another one. And I do give you credit. Only you can say burping and farting cows in a way that sounds very intellectual. But that is exactly what is going on. It's methane that's being released. And so, mathematically, and you've already alluded to this, and the book emphasizes this a lot, and this is starting to get us into what needs to happen. It's not like getting the 51 billion to, the rate of growth to slow isn't going to help us, or even to flatten it at 51 billion, or even if we were to reduce it to 25 billion or 10 billion, that's not going to solve the problem because it's cumulative. So a big thesis of the book is we have to get to zero or even negative.
Right. The residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is thousands of years. It's perfectly content to, bounce around. The oceans can absorb a little bit of that, but it's the sum of literally hundreds of years of emission that creates that temperature increase. And so if we want to have a year that's cooler than a previous year, that's zero is what finally allows you to achieve that. And a lot of people think, well, let's, put in mass transit and we'll drive less passenger miles around a city. And that could be a very good thing, less local pollution, letting people buy nice houses further away from the city. But it does not really take you towards zero. When you have, the units times the emissions per unit, the way to get to zero is to have that emissions per unit number drop to zero. And although less units, isn't a bad thing, it alone doesn't get you down to zero. So even with the electric car, it assumes that we take our electric generation and get that to be completely clean. So that miracle of making that totally green, we assume that, and then we convert direct use of hydrocarbons like natural gas to heat your house or office building, and we say, okay, let's electrify that. Now the electricity sector, because the energy has to come from somewhere, there's no free lunch in the energy game. So if you're not burning natural gas or coal, it means that you're going to be making about 3 times as much electricity. You have to keep it reliable, keep it cheap as you're going to 100% green. So, that sector is going to have to step up in a huge way, but that's good. It creates jobs and opportunity to fund them to build all that infrastructure.
And there's, you touched on it just now that, you either have less units, which is like, either kind of less miles driven or less people driving less miles, or that driving is more efficient. And, I think all of us in our friends, and we're all thinking about, okay, I ride my bike to work. I've lowered emissions. I live closer. I have a hybrid vehicle, or I'm driving an electric vehicle now. But there's a really important thing that you've spoken about for years, but you definitely highlight in this book is, even though many of us who are lucky to live in a fairly industrialized or post-industrial society where we can think about this form of conservation, you have large swaths of the earth, a majority of the earth, that is on that industrial growth curve. And is it fair to tell them, look, don't do what we did for the last 200 years? So how do you think about that? Because that seems like the units are going to go up, the miles are going to go up, the eating meat might go up. That makes it feel even a little bit more hopeless.
Yeah, that really brings us to this idea of the green premium, because I imagine the phone call in 2050 when you're calling up India and you're saying, hey, India, use the green approach, green cement, green steel, green electricity. And the appropriate response from India is, hey, wait a minute, we're still dealing with, air conditioning for these ridiculously hot days and basic shelter and lights at night. None of the extravagance that the rich countries engage in. And historically, our emissions have been so small that, it's your problem. You created this. And so we want you to subsidize us to do the green approach. Well, if that adds up to trillions of dollars that you'd ask to be sent just to one country, where all foreign aid is 130 billion a year, it's just not going to happen. And so my view is, unless we get the total extra cost for being green, which is over 5 trillion right now, unless we get that down by 95%, which would get it down to 250 billion a year, then that phone call with India, they're just going to say no. You go figure out, you do direct air capture, but we're dealing still with the basics here. And it's not, we can't slow down and buy this super expensive stuff. So green premium for all of these areas, it varies, of course, a lot from area to area, but I see that as the metric. Are we getting that 95% reduction That should be the long-term goal rather than just these short-term reductions, which are fine, but they have you do the easy stuff that has low green premiums, and you can miss or you even started on the hard parts of the problem.
Yeah, I definitely want to underline that notion, this green premium, which you talk a lot about in the book, which is if the non-green version costs $1, and then the kind of the green version of it costs $1.15, that 15 cents is the green premium. And there's some lower hanging fruits when it's that maybe a 10%, a 15% premium, but you've given examples in the book where it's a 600% premium. And then people are like, you're not, how are you going to actually do that? So I know, you've written this book is intended to, in some ways, shock us and make us wake up, but also be optimistic, not just be like, throw our hands up in the air and say, I hope something happens, or let's, move to Canada or something like that. So what, make us hopeful. The book has the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. So let's start with the solutions we have. What are you hopeful for that can at least make a dent? Well,
the category that is clearly on its way is passenger cars, through some great lithium-ion battery improvement, which was driven by the scale. The green premium on cars, in fact, I have a slide on this. If you compare a gasoline Chevrolet Malibu to a Chevrolet Bolt, the price difference isn't really big. You pay a little bit more upfront, but you save some on the maintenance and gasoline. You give up some range, but over the next 10 to 15 years, as the batteries improve, as the charging speed is much faster, really it's going to be fine. The green premium will drop to zero in this category. And so somebody like the CEO of General Motors, Mary Barra, can say, hey, I'm not going to make any more gasoline cars. Or various politicians can say, we're going to ban gasoline cars. So that's the ultimate, is when you get a category where the incentives, and there were lots of those, drive the scale that drives the innovation and competition to make it so, yes, the dirty approach is gone, and nobody's saying that was a big mistake. With cement, on the other hand, you see it's that double the cost, because both heating the limestone, say with natural gas, causes emissions, and then when the limestone breaks into the calcium and the CO2, that CO2 just goes up into the air. So you have two sources here, and cement is actually super cheap stuff. It's only, I was surprised, only $125 for a ton, but that ton of cement emits a ton of CO2 when it's made. Wow. And so what, where do you think we should focus our efforts on, before we get to the breakthrough side? Where do we focus on the stuff we have side of things? And, one thing I really appreciated about this book is someone going into reading it that I was like, I thought I know a good bit about the subject, but I really liked your framework for, like, anytime you're having a conversation with anyone on climate change, here are the questions to ask. So, how does your brain break down the problem and figure out where do you get the most yield for a certain amount of work? Well, the one thing that is kind of magic is that if consumers are willing to buy these green products and drive those markets, then you get more entrants and more new ideas, and scale really helps. So for solar panels, that happened. Germany and Japan put huge incentives on, later the US and others. And if you put aside the intermittency, it's cheaper to make electricity with solar panels and on-land wind now than any other approach. And so you'd think, okay, does that mean electricity is done? Well, because of the intermittency, we're not. We need, during periods of very tough weather, we need some way to have either storage or have some source that's not weather dependent, like nuclear fission or fusion. But we want to follow what happened with lithium ion or solar panels or wind. Now, that doesn't automatically happen. People talk about, making hydrogen, green hydrogen, and making that very cheap. I don't know if that will happen. The storage for the electric grid, we need to try that, but we need, a backup plan, which would be nuclear there. So for things like artificial meat, now when you go to the burger store, you'll see, Impossible Foods or Beyond, and, there'll be others. And you can say, okay, I don't like, killing animals. I don't like the greenhouse gas. They'll actually, these prices will come down, the quality will go up, even some health benefits in terms of what the composition is. So that, could scale up. It's less than 1% of all burgers today, but consumer preference that I want to contribute to this movement really is key to getting that to where, like the electric car, you're eventually saying, hey, I can't even tell the difference. It's, the price is about the same, why not?
Yeah. And we know, so many consumer decisions are made for things that are well beyond the exact utilitarian value of it. I look good in it. I remember seeing that ad. It was in a movie. James Bond drives it. It feels like the premium for this is definitely worth it. And to your point, it's coming close to zero. And actually, I didn't realize that wind and electricity were already there or even beyond there. But the point, this intermittency, which I think a lot of people miss, which is like, if it's nighttime, if it's cloudy, if the air is still, it's not like we don't have good mechanisms, cheap mechanisms to store energy. There are mechanisms. You can pump up water up a gradient. You can have large batteries. There are things you can do. So, but what I heard just now is it sounds like you don't think that storage is necessarily the solution. It might be other more, I guess, less intermittent forms of energy that are similarly green.
Yeah. So if you look at, say, a period where there's a big cold front sitting over the Midwest, so all the wind and solar out of that area is shut down, people still don't want to freeze to death. And so the amount of energy involved is mind-blowing. It's more than every battery ever made in history times 10. Likewise, Tokyo gets these typhoons, and yet, 23 million people, want to stay warm and stay connected. And so it's possible we'll get grid storage in some way, storing it as heat, actually pressuring water underground. There's a wild company that thinks that Breakthrough Energy is funded, that thinks that can contribute. A lot of different ideas about energy storage. And then in parallel, if 25% of those sources are nuclear, then it can have its own little store and it can step up during those periods. And we don't know, either one of those could run into problems. So in our innovation agenda, we have to have many, many ideas to have the probability of some way of dealing with this gigantic electric demand being as reliable as it is today, where it's basically not weather dependent.
And you just mentioned Breakthrough Energy. It's in the title of the book, The Breakthroughs We Need. You have an organization called Breakthrough Energy. Tell us actually a little bit more about this. This is some of I think, the most exciting stuff out there that a lot of people don't know about. Why are you working on this organization? If we go 5, 10 years, 20 years in the future, what do you hope will be the outcome?
Yeah, so in 2015, as they were doing the Paris Climate Conference, I was talking with President Hollande of France and President Obama, President Modi, and they were saying, okay, what would be constructive at Paris? And I said, you've got to have some R&D discussion, because basic R&D, whether it's medical breakthroughs or energy, that's the start of the innovation pipeline. In fact, here's the picture of that. So in Paris, we did get government leaders commit to big R&D increases. That's on the left there. And then there's an idea of just funding people to think, if they're in a big company, they may need a few years to put their ideas together. That's Fellows, where we just fund hundreds of people to think about new ideas. Then, you can have seed capital. That's where ventures come in. And that's like venture capital, but only focused on climate and taking a 20-year time frame. And then the idea of buying these things, even when they have high green premiums, and organizing money for that, that's called catalyst. So for every one of these areas, we need to move down that innovation pipeline, and there's government policy, and what we show is that you go through that over time. The goal is that green premium is going down, and we almost have a deadline for innovation here. Usually you just wait, to see what things happen. Here we have to sort of unnaturally push the smart people and the company formation and even the demonstration projects. We have to take more risk and move faster than we would if we didn't have this disaster looming.
Yeah, and it's what you just highlighted is very, very important. I think, especially coming from you, because so no one would doubt your belief in the private sector and your belief in market forces. But the idea that the things that Microsoft was able to do, the things that other tech companies have been able to do, the things that the biotech and the pharma industry has been able to do, they've done a lot, but it was built for the most part on very large R&D dollars that were either done for the sake of R&D or done for the military or done for NASA during the Cold War, 50s, 60s, 70s. The internet famously was a DARPANET, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's that type of baseline basic research R&D, which then you create the incentives that can flow on beyond that. Where do you see? Well, I have two questions. If you were, and I mean, you do have access to many of the decision makers in the world. What are you telling them? I'm almost, there's probably two things you could say. Like, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? And then, given the political realities that they face, what is your advice to them?
Yeah, there's three components to their policy. The first is the investment level in R&D and demo projects, and we need that. We need almost the same scale as the medical research we do at the National Institute of Health, which is presently 5 times larger than the energy R&D budget. And that's good. It creates jobs, and that's one thing that, particularly if it's done, in all the congressional districts, people can feel really good about. Then you have to have something to shape demand. The government is a buyer. Government tax incentives, which have worked really well for wind and solar. Now we have to apply them to these new areas like carbon capture, energy storage, green hydrogen, and the creativity doing that right. So you get behind technologies that really are going to scale up and get cheap. There'll be a lot of input on that. But without the government, it just doesn't happen, because the damage that's caused out there in the future, the person who's doing the emissions, they're just not aware of that. In some ways, a carbon tax would be very helpful. In some countries, that is being done. In the US, it's unlikely that we'll have a big, broad carbon tax. It'll probably be the tax-related things will be more directed to specific areas. The carbon tax alone isn't a solution, because you'd have to have that carbon tax as high as the highest green premium, or else you're just shifting to, again, work on the easier things that don't get you all the way to zero. But you're right, practicality on these policies, we're going to have to bring in a lot of experts, but it'll only happen if the young generation is really pushing this forward as the moral thing that they want to speak up about and care about and organize around, ideally, no matter what political party they're involved with.
And what would you speak to people? We're talking to a Texas audience today. Texas has been going through a hard time right now with its electrical grid. Clearly, what this book touches on is energy, and you know a lot about these things. What is your understanding of what led to the difficulties that Texas has been facing?
Yeah, I'd say three things about that. The first is that unusual cold conditions like this will be happening more often because of climate, because the winds that keep the cold air up in Canada aren't moving as fast, and so you can have these cold fronts move in and go quite a bit south. So this will be more typical, even though it's freezing, not warming. The second thing is that the notion that their particular problem during the tragedy, which I understand, a number of people died, wasn't because they had too many renewables. All of their power sources, including natural gas, even one nuclear reactor, hadn't been weatherized enough. And then that's combined with the fact that Texas's ability to draw on other states is the most limited, because it has its own grid, not connected to the big West grid and the big east grid. I will say that the general issue, though, that as you put intermittent sources onto the grid and get up to super large numbers, that is a legitimate issue. We're at 6% of those renewables, wind and solar today, and people talk about, can you get up to 70%, 80%, and if so, how much transmission, storage, nuclear, and a diversity of renewable sites do you need? And that's, there's a great open source model that Breakthrough Energy is doing, so you can play around with the sources of the power and then take the extreme weather conditions and see, do you keep everybody warm during the cold time, and do you avoid overheating during the heat waves?
And I want to double click on at least two of the things you just mentioned. This first is this notion that global warming and climate change can actually lead to more of these extreme cold spells further south than expected. I just want to, because some people will say, wait, it's supposed to be global warming. Now we're getting colder than expected weather. So what's happening is on average, temperatures could go up, but they're also getting out of balance, I guess. And
that's right. The variance on temperature spreads out quite a bit because you have wind masses that are able to migrate to the south more. We also see that on rainfall, that it's warmer, so of course more water's evaporating. But some places, like the center of a continent, you mostly get the evaporation, so it's drier there. But net, because you have more water going up in the air, then you have other places where you have more floods. And so, some people have proposed that instead of climate change, we call it, weather weirding or something like that, to show that it's not just this temperature forcing, but a breakdown in the stability of the conditions that we've gotten used to.
And this other thing that you mentioned, weatherizing, which we've heard a lot about in the news, what exactly does that mean? It's just that the grid, the infrastructure wasn't ready for these, sub-zero temperatures for extended periods of time?
Exactly. So all these power sources, wind, nuclear, and natural gas, can run in North Dakota and Alaska, but they spend extra money to make sure that none of the equipment freezes. They have to make sure, like if the wind, if you get water in there, that it doesn't freeze and make ice. And the incentives they used in the Texas power bid market, in retrospect, people are saying, now, wow, we should have funded reliability or standby power more than we chose to do. We underestimated the risk of this. The governor, fired some of the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, that manages these things, because they hadn't spent that money. Just looking back at the past weather records, they viewed that as so unlikely, but things are changing, sadly, and they paid a big price.
And what are the lessons learned there? I mean, this is one of those classic traps that many organizations or governments fall into, where there's these kind of further out possibilities, but when they happen, everyone says, everyone's kind of pointing fingers. Are there lessons to be learned about this particular situation, or even human lessons about climate change and our preparation for it generally?
Yeah, counting on government to anticipate bad things, particularly where a small amount of money can make a big difference, like being ready to do more testing. In the case of the pandemic, a few countries did that well. The U.S. was a bit slow, and so we got very widespread disease and this incredible tragedy. Being ready for weather events, do you have snow plows or not? Do you have an alternate plan? We just have to add that to the list, because climate change will make us face more of these unexpected things. And yet people are outraged. The idea that, you might freeze to death, you really want to almost bring the chance of that to zero.
And is the solution, at least in the Texas example, just weatherize everything, or are there other things you have to think about?
Well, the big thing is to grow the U.S. grid. including Texas, so that if you, whatever strange conditions you have in one state, you get the diversity. The U.S. is very lucky, particularly if we team up with Canada. We have so many power sources that with the right transmission, compared to, say, Japan, which doesn't want to depend on other countries, you can have a single weather front over most of Japan. So if we get the grid right, that does a lot. Then we need to invest in energy storage that can take, the hot sunny days in the summer and save it up for tough weather events or the winter. And then we need to consider sources that are not weather dependent.
I grew up in Louisiana, in New Orleans, which is, its economy used to be very much around energy, it still is. And obviously Houston is kind of the energy capital of the country, where people are feeling a little conflicted about this. They're like, okay, I get it. And look, the Gulf is also very susceptible to the effects of climate change. There might be some of the first parts of the regions, they're already seeing it. But at the same time, they're like, my uncle works on a oil rig. The major employers in my town are energy companies. What would you say to someone in Texas about how to is there a tension here? Is it a zero sum game, or can we grow the pie?
Well, definitely, we're going to use a lot more hydrocarbons between now and 2050. Whether you can take, say, natural gas and have that be the source for clean hydrogen, that would be very helpful. Can you convert all these pipelines, put a lining in so that they can move the green hydrogen around instead of moving natural gas around? A lot of these things are the complex engineering skills that the oil industry is the best at. Can you mine for green hydrogen? Can you put nuclear waste super deep? Can you sequester lots and lots of CO2, which is, even more than all the gas and oil that we pull out of the ground? Some of these companies are doing things like biofuels or electrofuels, which would be great because they fit right into the trucks and planes that it's not going to be easy to use a battery type approach. We're engaging them on green hydrogen. We want the skill sets in those companies. Some of these companies won't go into these new areas, and so over time they might be smaller, but you'd like to use the people and the skill sets because, talk about complex engineering, what we're going to do to the grid, these new power sources. This is, requires the kinds of things that those companies are great at facilitating. But, and for anybody left behind, what are those policies? Is it ever work to retrain, help people move? Part of the bill for climate change is going to be taking care of that pain of adjustment.
No, absolutely. And, going back to the solution side of things, your organization, Breakthrough Energy, either within that or in the broader world, what are you most excited about that could be the type of breakthrough that could maybe not solve on its own, but make a dent in the 51 billion?
Yeah, part of the key point of the book is that it's going to be about a dozen in total. I'm always amazed. Can you actually burn garbage in a positive way? And there are people who think you can, without, any bad emissions there. Some of these people who, say we can get the green hydrogen price down super, super low. I'm like, really? There's a fundamental energy need, either splitting the water or pulling the H's off the CH4. And yet now there's some incredible people energized on that. And if you get cheap enough green hydrogen, that really plays many roles. It can be an energy store where you create it when the wind is blowing and then you burn it, say at night when the wind's not there. It can be an input to make steel, so you have to take the iron oxides and you got to pull those oxides off. And you can do that with hydrogen. It's a great reducing agent there. And but right now the green premium for that approach is gigantic. But there's some new thinking. The cement and steel industry, we haven't put the highest IQ people in America into that. It's a little bit better to write, internet software or, cure cancer. So we do need, to excite some of the best people, not necessarily, to do financial products or weapons or whatever, but going into clean energy. And, there are glimpses of things that I wouldn't have expected. The artificial meat thing has gone a lot faster than I would have expected. In fact, unlike batteries, where most of the companies I've invested in have failed, not QuantumScape and a few others, but most of them, in the artificial food business, both Beyond and Impossible that I was involved with, they're doing really, really well. And thank goodness that consumers value their approach.
And what about, if a year from now, 2 years from now, are there going to be, I know we can't predict it, but where are you most hopeful? One of the things I've learned from you is, some of what you're doing in nuclear, and nuclear has all of this, I would say, bad branding, maybe an earned bad brand over the, there've been a few disasters in the last 100 years, but where are we going with nuclear? I mean, I think y'all are working on stuff where we could have without real waste, or we can use existing waste as fuel. How is that going?
Nuclear is amazing because each reaction creates 1,000,000 times as much energy as burning hydrocarbons. It inherently should be very, very cheap. Now, sadly, as you split that uranium atom, the results are radioactive material that's very dangerous. And so if you let that leave the reactor, then the impacts on human health, primarily at Chernobyl, are really awful. And so we need a design, which means starting from scratch, that since the 1950s, we've just taken this high water pressure approach and worked on that. Any reactor that has a lot of pressure in the reactor, it's just too hard to make it safe. Anything that requires an operator to push buttons to avoid a disaster, that's not a good design. It's got to be just physics that the radioactive stuff wants to stay in. So no pressure. Your heat pool has to be so over-designed that, and we have to use this sodium metal that can store a lot of heat. So I'm actually very excited about that. Now, we have to build the demo plant that the US government last year agreed to fund 50%, with my committing the other 50%. So this company, TerraPower, is going to take the next 5 years and prove out. Nuclear power had gotten too expensive, particularly if you're competing with natural gas. Wow. In the US, making electricity from a nuclear power reactor competitive, it's been almost 4 to 5 times too expensive to play in the market. So, we're working on that. We have this great team. You can digitally simulate all these things. People warn me that, the public acceptance is going to be a barrier, and that's perfectly fair. Even though nuclear has killed, way, way less people per unit of power than, say, coal or natural gas, just the word nuclear is a challenge there. But I think we can do it. And, without a storage miracle, this will have to be part of that gigantic electric grid that's reliable and clean.
Yeah. I could keep, I have hours more of questions, but I know we also have a lot of audience questions, and I want to make sure I get to them because, frankly, they're probably better than the questions I would ask anyway.
I don't know.
So we have this first question from the audience. Can you please speak on individual responsibility versus corporate responsibility in combating climate change? Yes, it is actually a better question than I would have.
Well, the political voice of getting, people, no matter what they think about other political issues, try to draw them in and give them a sense of understanding and hope to get beyond this. That's number one. That's going to be super necessary. Number two, you as a consumer, when you buy that electric car or that Impossible burger, that's driving up the volume, which lets those companies scale up and innovate. And there'll be more and more product categories like that. Finally, we are looking at, you can give to various political organizations, sure, but we're actually thinking of having a fund where it goes and does the offsets So for a few hundred a year or 1,000 a year, depending on what tier, this thing called Catalyst, we might actually try and get lots of consumers, as they think about their emissions, to offset those by putting money into the products that, even as they buy them, they not only are lower emissions, but these are the products that are on the learning curve, like the solar panels were, that can get all the way to that zero green premium. So, still some work to be done to organize the interest that people have in this topic and make sure that it doesn't wax and wane, because when you're saying to the steel industry, hey, rebuild everything, you've got to have a constant message there to orchestrate that type of capital rebuild.
Absolutely. There's another question here, and we could take this on the topic, but you could also answer it more broadly. What are your hopes for the current administration? What should we be focusing on as a country right now? Another audience question.
Yeah, I think the Biden 4 priorities are, very appropriate. Getting out of this pandemic, so that includes getting kids back in school, getting businesses going. Super important there. A lot of issues around equity. The inner city schools had a tougher time doing the online learning, and sadly that inequity, which was already there, has been exacerbated. So the groups that are Black had a tougher time in many respects. Hispanics had a tougher time, and their schools just fell short. They weren't ready for this. And then finally, climate. And climate, you can do a lot of infrastructure building that creates the jobs and helps advance these things. Because the US has the majority of the innovation power in the world, we kind of owe it to the world, not just to reduce our emissions, but to do those green premium reductions. And of course, then you can export those things. That's a very private sector jobs thing if the policies have enabled that. So, climate's not the only thing going on. It's a thing that if it isn't given special treatment, it can slide down the agenda, because although there are wildfires and strange weather, it's not nearly as bad as it will be. And it's that future difficulty that justifies moving it up the agenda. The Biden administration has a ton of people who care about this, even in, like the National Economic Advisor was Obama's climate person, Brian Deese. It's quite for John Kerry, Gene McCarthy, Secretary Granholm, they are going to have, the strongest team. And of course, during the political debates, this topic came up more than ever. And so that's very appropriate.
Yeah. And, most of us, our inner egos like to be proven right. But I know you have stated, you gave that TED talk 5-6 years ago about the pandemic, and you so wish that you were not right. But, that was one of those things. I remember watching it 5 years ago. I was like, yeah, that's interesting. But, who knows when a pandemic, I have other things to do. But the consequences of us not investing a few billion then has now led to probably many hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars of negative consequences now. And that's almost, it really seems like a practice run for what we could see on climate in terms of the cost to folks. So yeah, I will just emphasize for folks, anyone who thinks Mr. Gates does not have credibility, which I don't know many people, but yeah, I don't think any of us want to be right about this climate stuff, but it needs to be taken seriously. Another great question. Any books other than there's the book that we're talking about that people should read, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, but other books, documentaries, podcast recommendations that have informed your research or that you would recommend for someone who's interested in the space?
There's series like, The Years of Living Dangerously that document some of the negative effects that we're already seen. There's an Attenborough movie where he reflects on how beautiful nature's been throughout his life and how that's been somewhat degraded. And even though it's not really a climate movie, it's the best motivator that I've seen. Elizabeth Colbert, her books, Fifth Extinction, she's got a new one coming. She documents some of the people who work in this area and some of the natural ecosystem decline as well. It's not a field where there's, any single book. To understand energy, Václav Smil, Energy and Civilization, is pretty phenomenal at showing us how all these things developed, and that, the modern age is the energy intense age, and sort of showing how long it takes to build up these big infrastructures. And he likes to point out that we've never changed things as fast as we're saying we need to in these next 30 years. So he wonders, are we going to pull off something that would be unprecedented? And, that's a very fair question.
I grimaced a little bit when you mentioned that last book, because I have a copy of it, actually, when I've heard you in other forums talk about that book. And I pride myself in the ability to read dense texts. But I will give you credit that your book is far easier to digest and process this info. But you're right. The ideas in Smil's book are very important about, how we think about energy, which frankly, most people don't do on a day-to-day basis. This is a great question from the audience. What are some of the most surprising things you learned when you researched this book? Was there anything new, any new ahas as you went through this process?
Well, I thought, when I went out to say, okay, I've got to offset my emissions, and see how hard that is. When I went to buy the aviation biofuel, there was none at my airport. And so I, made a multi-year commitment, over 7 million a year going into that general thing. And, I was the customer number one. Now I've recruited others and said, come on, let's be catalytic. It's sort of the start of this catalyst idea is we need buyers for these things. So the incentive and learning is taking place. I was pretty stunned at that. And, when you go online and look at what's out there, a lot of it is still kind of the, come on, it's not real stuff, which in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of conspiracy theories, some, focus on me and, did I invent it, or am I chipping people, things that aren't really that plausible. But whenever you're asking society to change, the sense they're looking for some evil agenda that's connected to it, we see that a bit with climate. And it's kind of a shame, how this whole social media, how do you make it more accurate, not draw people into non-factual things, and yet not give up the dynamic nature of it. I don't know, that a lot of people ask me that because, of course, my background in technology, and I'm hoping that's another thing I delegate to the young generation to keep the good parts with the bad parts, because we see it in climate as well.
Actually, I know this is a little off topic, but you touched on this, and I've actually always been dying to ask you this. I mean, how does that make you feel when you're even well before the climate conversation, what's going on with the pandemic? You're helping to eradicate diseases in large parts of the world, millions of lives saved, but people project these kind of ulterior motives. I mean, your work on the pandemic, I saw this crazy stuff people were saying around either that you're somehow trying to make money off of it, or you're trying to sterilize. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy things out there. And then in climate, people project that, I don't know, and I've had the privilege of getting to know you, and we've been in meetings where you're pushing me, hey, how do we know we're helping people? How do we know we're helping people? How do we know we're helping people? So, I mean, how does that make you feel? Do you sometimes just say, well, I'm just going to give up. I can live my Bill Gates life. And how do you think about that?
Well, I'm not discouraged by it. I have to say it's gotten more intense with the pandemic, and so I never would have expected it. Mostly when you work on infectious disease, the main thing is nobody is that interested. I mean, you go to a cocktail party and talk about TB and HIV. I think of Dr. Fauci and I as two infectious disease nerds, and so the fact that there he is on the cover of InStyle magazine, and Saturday Night Live is showing him his personality. I'm like, wow, us disease guys maybe we're cooler than we used to think we were. Briefly, we'll go back to nobody wanting to talk about these diseases fairly quickly. So it's kind of a humorous thing. I hope it doesn't result in people, not trusting vaccines, not wearing masks, because that's where, it really gets problematic, things like, attacking the Capitol is not, a great thing. Here with the vaccine, we want to get up to like 70 or 80% coverage. And yet, we may not be able to because of that, those rumors that, it's not really good for you. Although it's getting a little better as people see their friends, their older friends, taking it and being protected and not having common side effects. I think that is helping to build the credibility. And, as the pandemic ends, will all this crazy conspiracy stuff die down? I really hope that it does, because, what's been done in terms of creating the vaccine and getting it out, it's so incredible that now we're scrambling of, okay, do the developing countries get it? How do we deal with the variants? Which one is right for which country? I mean, everybody wants it right now, because that is going to get us to the end here and give us the capacity then to focus in on, the equity, the improving education that you do so much amazing work on, and climate change, and not just the short-term things that the pandemic have forced us to focus on.
Absolutely. And I know we're short of time. I wish we could spend hours on this, and people could spend hours on the book, because there's a lot in that. But maybe one last question. What advice would you have for anyone? My advice is read the book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. But above and beyond that, what tangible things should we as individuals do to make a dent?
Yeah, I think the educational material on climate, there's something to be done there. That the two of us could brainstorm about that, because actually, if you want kids to learn science, you can start with, okay, here's the problem. Now let's teach you about heat and, the atmosphere, and, you can have an understanding of why this is so difficult. So, science helps people understand climate, and climate should push the back the other way. And I don't think there's yet a way that it's kind of integrated into the curriculum as a motivator. And that, we need all the young people to at least be able to talk about these things in the right way. It is it's a special time in terms of the build back funds that are going to go out. It's hopefully we can keep our attention on this. When we had the financial crisis, the interest in climate went down a lot, but it had never gotten to the level it's gotten at now. And partly, reporting flooding and weather events and explaining to people the connection, I think that's helped a lot. Sadly, those things aren't going away. That as the temperature goes up, they just you get more and more of it. So I think that's helped people. There's many skill sets that can contribute to this cause. Communicators, we need you. I was talking to people in Congress today, and they were saying how it's hard to get this across, and the stories of success, getting those out there. So, I'm hopeful, but it's going to have to be a big collective effort.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, Bill, I know we're all out of time. Thank you so much for answering these questions, and actually thank you for writing this book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. And actually, thank you for working on this problem, taking your energies, and even though sometimes the world gives you sometimes a hard time, for you to keep powering through all of these. And special thanks to Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston and the Book People Bookshop in Austin for hosting this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sal. That was a very fun conversation. I always enjoy our work together.
Likewise.
Thank you. That was absolutely amazing. I'm Christina LeBron for Book People in Austin, Texas. And we want to thank you all for joining us tonight for a virtual conversation with Bill Gates and Sal Khan. Book People and Blue Willow Bookshop appreciate your support, and we see you at the next event. Thank you.